The United States military has assembled the largest concentration of naval and air power in the Middle East since the Iraq War. 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, over 50 fighter jets, stealth bombers capable of flying 30-hour round-trip missions, missile defense batteries, and enough precision munitions for weeks of sustained combat operations. This isn't a show of force. This isn't saber rattling. This is operational deployment built for sustained warfare. The Pentagon has moved from simple presence operations to combat readiness for what defense officials describe as multi-week sustained operations, if necessary. While diplomats negotiate in Geneva, satellite images reveal Iran frantically fortifying its nuclear facilities with fresh concrete and underground bunkers. Iranian military officials have warned that any U.S. strike will be considered total war, and promised retaliation against American bases across the Middle East. President Trump said it plainly, "We have to make a deal or it's going to be very traumatic, very traumatic." He's warning Iran faces consequences if diplomacy fails. But the military force he's assembled isn't designed for a limited strike. It's designed for a sustained campaign that could last weeks. When you understand the full scale of what America has deployed, why Iran is preparing for the worst, and what this force is actually capable of doing, you'll realize we're closer to war with Iran than at any point in modern history. And if it happens, it won't be a quick surgical strike. It will be a multi-week air campaign unlike anything we've seen since Iraq. Let me walk you through exactly what's deployed, what it's designed to do, and why the next few weeks could determine whether we're heading into the biggest Middle East war in decades. The core of American power in the region is 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, not 1, 2. That's a configuration rarely seen outside major conflicts. USS Abraham Lincoln is operating in the Arabian Sea, supported by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including USS Spruance, USS Michael Murphy, USS Frankie Peterson Jr., and USS Pinckney. This is a complete carrier strike group with anti-air, anti-missile, and anti-submarine capabilities. USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, is transiting through the Mediterranean, escorted by USS Bainbridge and USS Mahan. Once Ford arrives in theater, the U.S. Navy will have a 2-carrier strike force operational simultaneously. Let's talk about what that actually means in terms of combat capability, because the numbers are staggering. Under high-tempo operations, a single carrier air wing can generate over 100 sorties in 24 hours, depending on refueling and target distance. With 2 carriers operating in parallel, planners can ensure continuous strike cycles. Flight decks rotate, allowing aircraft to launch from one carrier while the other rearms and recovers planes. This posture enables sustained pressure over multiple days rather than isolated waves of attacks. It's not about hitting Iran once and hoping for the best. It's about maintaining continuous air operations for weeks. Each carrier typically has about 75 aircraft. FA-18 Super Hornets for strike missions, EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare and defense suppression, E-2 Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, helicopters for search and rescue, and anti-submarine warfare. 2 carriers means roughly 150 aircraft that can be cycled through continuous operations. While one group of planes is striking targets, another group is refueling and rearming. While some pilots rest, others are in the air. The capability to maintain pressure 24/7 for extended periods. But the carriers are just the beginning. The regional air presence has been massively reinforced with some of America's most advanced combat aircraft. F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning IIs have been redeployed to regional bases. These are 5th-generation stealth fighters, designed specifically to penetrate advanced air defense systems. Iran has Russian-made S-300 air defense batteries and domestically produced Bavar 373 systems. These are sophisticated integrated air defense networks that can track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. The F-22s and F-35s are designed to suppress these defenses. They operate undetected, identify radar sites and missile batteries, and destroy them before they can effectively engage follow-on aircraft. Once air defenses are degraded, that's when the F-15E Strike Eagles and carrier-based FA-18s conduct follow-up strikes against missile infrastructure, command centers, and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps facilities. This is standard suppression of enemy air defenses doctrine, First wave takes out the radars and missiles. Second wave strikes the actual targets. Third wave assesses damage and hits anything that survived. Then there are the bombers. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers operating from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri with mid-air refueling can conduct 30-hour round-trip missions to Iran. These are the only platforms configured to drop the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. This is a bunker-buster bomb specifically designed to destroy deeply buried hardened targets. Why does that matter? Because satellite images show Iran is frantically fortifying its nuclear facilities. Commercial satellite imagery published in a report by the Institute for Science and International Security shows Iran reinforcing the Pentagon 2 facility at Parchin with fresh concrete and excavated material. Similar reinforcement work is underway at tunnel entrances near Natanz. Defense analyst Can Kasapolu explained the problem. The fundamental issue is that all these efforts would complicate battle damage assessment after a strike. Fortified underground targets require repeated penetrating strikes, multiple munitions on the same coordinates, follow-up missions to determine whether facilities have actually been neutralized. This type of campaign demands sustained sortie generation and significant munition reserves. You can't just hit these targets once and assume they're destroyed. You have to hit them, assess damage, hit them again, assess again, keep hitting until you're confident they're actually neutralized. That's why this deployment is built for weeks of operations, not days. Senior U.S. officials revealed that the Pentagon is preparing for multi-week sustained operations if conflict breaks out, unlike the one-time strikes of Operation Midnight Hammer conducted in June 2025. Defense analysts say this timeline reflects the realities of munition consumption rates and forward-deployed stocks. In high-intensity conflict simulations, forward-deployed precision munitions can be significantly depleted within roughly 3 to 4 weeks, depending on sortie tempo and target density. Beyond that window, forces increasingly depend on resupply from the continental United States, a process that can require several additional weeks to establish a true seaborne logistics bridge. Operations may not be halted, but campaign duration will depend heavily on resupply cycles and industrial production, not just aircraft availability. Translation: the U.S. has enough bombs and missiles already in theater to conduct intensive operations for about 3 to 4 weeks. After that, they need resupply from the U.S. mainland, which takes additional weeks to set up. So the Pentagon is planning for a window of 3 to 4 weeks of maximum intensity operations. That's not a weekend strike. That's a sustained air campaign comparable to the opening phases of the Iraq War. Now let's talk about what's notably absent from this deployment, because it tells us what kind of war this would be. There are no large-scale ground combat formations deploying to Kuwait or Iraq for occupation. No brigade combat teams staging for invasion. No massive ground force buildup like we saw before Iraq in 2003. The focus is entirely on long-range strikes and precision air power. This is a campaign designed to degrade targets from distance, not to conquer and hold territory. This distinction carries enormous political weight. A Quinnipiac University poll from January 2026 found 70% of American voters oppose direct war with Iran. They're even more reluctant about deploying ground troops. Any notion of potential U.S. military involvement in Iranian internal chaos is firmly rejected, while voters indicate that congressional approval should constitute a last resort against any military involvement in a foreign crisis, said Quinnipiac analyst Tim Malloy. Trump and Pentagon planners clearly understand this. The American public will not support another ground war in the Middle East. But an air campaign that doesn't put large numbers of American troops in harm's way might be politically sustainable if framed as preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So this deployment is specifically designed for the kind of war Americans might accept. Bombs from the air, no boots on the ground, limited American casualties, focused on a specific objective. Now let's talk about Iranian preparations, because they're clearly taking the threat seriously. Satellite images show Iran burying and hardening its most sensitive nuclear facilities. Pentagon 2 at Parchin is being encased in a concrete sarcophagus before being covered with earth. Tunnel entrances at Natanz are being reinforced. Dump trucks are moving massive amounts of material. This is defensive preparation for an expected attack. Iran knows these facilities are primary targets, and they're doing everything possible to protect them. But here's the problem for Iran. Even heavily fortified underground facilities can be destroyed with repeated strikes using bunker buster munitions. It just takes more bombs and more sorties. The US has the capability to conduct those repeated strikes. Iran is betting that fortification will either deter the US from attacking or make attacks ineffective. The US is betting that sustained operations with advanced munitions can destroy even fortified targets. We're about to find out who's right. Iranian officials have issued stark warnings about retaliation. Senior Iranian military officials stated that any US strike would be considered total war. They've warned that American bases in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey would be targeted if Washington attacks. Iran has ballistic missiles capable of reaching all of these locations. In response, the US has deployed Patriot and THAAD missile defense batteries to regional hubs to protect installations against potential missile retaliation. Think about what this means. The US is deploying defensive systems because they expect Iran to fire missiles at American bases if war breaks out. They're not confident they can prevent Iranian retaliation. They're preparing to defend against it. This dramatically increases the stakes. If the US strikes Iran and Iran successfully hits American bases, killing US troops, the conflict escalates immediately. Trump would face enormous pressure to respond even more aggressively. Iran would face pressure to continue attacking. This is how limited strikes turn into extended wars. Each side retaliates, casualties mount, neither side can back down without looking weak. The conflict spirals. Former US Ambassador Susan Ziyadeh said, "Having this much firepower in the region creates its own dynamic. Sometimes that dynamic is hard to slow down." That's diplomat speak for. Once you assemble this much military force in one place, the momentum toward using it becomes very strong. Military planners start seeing windows of opportunity. Politicians feel pressure to act. The mere presence of overwhelming force creates incentives to use it. Now let's talk about the diplomatic track, because talks are still happening even as military forces mass. Iranian officials have said they will return in coming weeks with additional proposals aimed at narrowing gaps in negotiations. Geneva talks continue. Both sides are still talking, but Trump's rhetoric suggests limited patience. "We have to make a deal, or it's going to be very traumatic," he said recently. That's Trump giving Iran a clear ultimatum: make a deal that satisfies American demands, or face military action. No ambiguity, no diplomatic hedging, just a straightforward threat. What would a deal look like? The US wants Iran to stop enriching uranium to weapons-grade levels, allow intrusive inspections, and significantly roll back its nuclear program. Iran wants sanctions relief and security guarantees. The gap between these positions remains large. Iran sees its nuclear program as leverage and insurance against regime change. The US sees Iran's nuclear program as an unacceptable threat. Can that gap be bridged? Possibly, but it requires both sides making concessions that will be politically painful domestically. For Iran, accepting limits on its nuclear program means giving up its main leverage and insurance policy. Hardliners in Tehran will view any deal as capitulation. For the US, accepting anything less than complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear infrastructure will be criticized by hawks as insufficient. Trump will face accusations of making a weak deal. So both sides face domestic political constraints that make agreement difficult. But both sides also understand that the alternative is war, which neither actually wants. Iran's military is no match for American air power. Iranian leaders know that a war with the US means devastating strikes on their military infrastructure, economic installations, and possibly leadership targets. The regime could survive, but it would be severely weakened. The US military could certainly conduct a successful air campaign against Iran, but then what? Iran doesn't surrender. The regime survives. They retaliate against American bases and allies. Oil prices spike. Regional allies get attacked. The Middle East destabilizes further. There's no good outcome here, just different levels of bad. That's why, despite the military buildup, diplomacy continues. Both sides understand that war is lose-lose. The question is whether they can find a diplomatic solution before the momentum toward conflict becomes unstoppable. Let's talk about what actual war with Iran would look like based on this deployment. Day 1. F-22s and F-35s penetrate Iranian airspace, identify air defense systems, and destroy radars and missile batteries. Electronic warfare aircraft jam communications and blind remaining defenses. Day 2. With air defenses suppressed, F-15s and F-A-18s begin systematic strikes against Iranian missile facilities, Revolutionary Guard bases, command and control centers, and nuclear-related sites. Day 3. B-2 bombers drop massive bunker busters on hardened underground facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Parchin. Multiple strikes on the same targets to ensure penetration. Days 4 through 7, continued strikes cycling between carriers, battle damage assessment missions, restrikes on surviving targets, expansion of target list as intelligence identifies additional sites. Week 2, continued pressure. Munition stocks depleting but still adequate. Iranian retaliation against regional bases absorbed by missile defenses. Some hits get through causing U.S. casualties. Pressure mounts for escalation. Week 3, operational tempo maintained, but logistics starting to strain. Resupply operations from U.S. beginning. Political pressure in both countries mounting. Civilian casualties in Iran mounting. Regional instability increasing. Week 4, campaign objectives largely achieved, but Iran has not surrendered or agreed to terms. U.S. faces decision, continue operations requiring extensive resupply, or accept a military victory that doesn't achieve political objectives. This is the challenge of air campaigns. They can destroy targets very effectively, but destroying targets doesn't automatically achieve political goals. You can bomb a country extensively without actually changing its government's behavior. Iraq in 1991 is a case study. The U.S.-led coalition conducted devastating airstrikes for 6 weeks. Iraq's military was crippled, but Saddam Hussein remained in power for another 12 years until the ground invasion in 2003. So even if the U.S. conducts a highly successful air campaign against Iran, what have we actually achieved if the Iranian regime survives and refuses to make concessions? This is the fundamental strategic problem. Military force can destroy things, but creating desired political outcomes is much more difficult. Now let's talk about regional implications because a U.S.-Iran war doesn't stay contained. Hezbollah in Lebanon, backed by Iran, would likely attack Israel. Israel would retaliate against Lebanon. Suddenly you have a second front. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria would attack American forces and bases. U.S. troops who aren't even part of the Iran campaign become targets. Houthi rebels in Yemen, supplied by Iran, would escalate attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and potentially target Saudi Arabia. Iran could try to close or disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil supply passes. Even unsuccessful attempts would spike oil prices and create economic shock. Regional U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and UAE face Iranian missile attacks on their territory and oil infrastructure. They're forced to choose between actively supporting the U.S. or trying to stay neutral. Turkey, a NATO ally, faces pressure from both sides, hosting American bases that are used to strike Iran while trying to maintain some relationship with Iran for economic reasons. The entire region destabilizes. Oil prices surge. Global economy takes a hit. The instability creates opportunities for ISIS remnants and other extremist groups to exploit chaos. And all of this assumes the conflict doesn't spread beyond the Middle East. Russia and China both have relationships with Iran. How do they respond? Probably not with direct military intervention, but with diplomatic support, weapons sales, sanctions busting, and other measures that complicate American objectives. This is why war with Iran is so dangerous. Not because the U.S. couldn't militarily prevail in a conventional conflict, but because the second-order and third-order effects spiral in unpredictable ways. Here's the bottom line and why this matters more than almost any other story happening right now. The United States has deployed the largest concentration of military power in the Middle East since the Iraq War. 2 carrier strike groups, advanced stealth fighters, bombers with bunker-busting capabilities, missile defenses, forward-deployed munitions for weeks of sustained operations. This isn't a show of force. This is operational deployment for sustained warfare if diplomacy fails. Iran is frantically fortifying its nuclear facilities, expecting attack. Iranian officials warn any U.S. strike means total war and promise retaliation against American bases. Trump has given Iran an ultimatum: make a deal or face very traumatic consequences. Talks continue in Geneva, but the gap between positions remains large. If war happens, it won't be a limited strike. Pentagon planning assumes multi-week sustained operations, thousands of sorties, repeated strikes on hardened targets, a full air campaign. But there's no ground invasion planned. The American public won't support that. This would be bombs from the air designed to degrade Iranian capabilities without occupying territory. The problem is that military success doesn't guarantee political success. You can destroy Iranian facilities without actually changing the regime's behavior or achieving your political objectives. And regional spillover is inevitable. Hezbollah attacks Israel. Militias attack U.S. bases. Houthis disrupt shipping. Oil prices spike. The entire Middle East destabilizes. Both sides understand war is lose-lose, but momentum builds. Military forces assembled. Ultimatums issued. Domestic political pressures mount. The window for diplomacy narrows. We're in the most dangerous period of U.S.-Iran relations in decades. The force deployed near Iran isn't designed for deterrence or demonstration. It's designed for weeks of sustained combat if ordered. Whether it gets used depends on negotiations happening right now in Geneva. If those talks fail, the largest air campaign since Iraq could begin within weeks. Trump said it would be very traumatic. For once, he's probably not exaggerating.